Right, well, welcome everybody to the Lower Windrush Valley Project annual forum. I hope you can all see my screen. Rachel, you'll have to let me know if not. I'm Lucy Kennery. I will be hosting the event this evening along with Rachel. Apologies that I don't have my camera on. Unfortunately, I don't seem to be able to have my video and the slide sharing at the same time, but I will switch it on later when we get to doing some questions. You should all have your microphones muted and your cameras turned off. We're going to keep it like that for the whole of this evening. We will do questions after each presentation, but what we'll do is we will use the chat function on Zoom. So if you're not familiar with that, you should, if you move your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, have a chat function there, which you can put your questions in. Please do that throughout the presentations and we will answer them at the end. And then last but not least, we are recording this evening's presentation. Hopefully it's going to work. And then we'll be able to share it with people later so you can listen again or share it with anybody that wasn't able to attend. So an overview of what will be part of the Lower Windrush Valley Project presentation this evening. Initially, I'm going to talk about Friends of the Lower Windrush Valley, which is our volunteers. I'll give an update on the nature reserves and our bird hides. We'll then look back on some of our projects and some of the work that we've carried out in 2020, and then look forwards to what to expect in 2021. So it's been an unusual year in a lot of ways, but for the Friends of the Lower Windrush Valley, obviously we haven't been able to run all of our activities as we usually would have done. Just to give you an idea for those of you who aren't familiar with the Friends group or our volunteering, we've got lots of different activities happening. We have a task group who meet on the second and fourth Thursday of every month, and they carry out practical maintenance and habitat management activities at our reserves and on local footpaths. We also have reserve wardens. We have volunteers who enter bird records from our bird hides. And then we've also had volunteers help us out with a visitor survey this year, which I will mention later in the presentation. A big thank you to all of the volunteers this year. It's been, as I said, slightly different. At the moment, we're not running sessions, but hopefully once we come out of this second lockdown, we'll be able to start running them again. We've obviously introduced some additional measures and a maximum number of participants at each session as well. So an update on the reserves. Both Rushy Common and Stanlake Common Nature Reserves this year, the main activities have been the sort of annual maintenance of the sites, so things like grass cutting and managing the trees and scrub. We did also carry out a wetland plant survey at Rushy Common in the summer. That's something that's done periodically as part of the monitoring for the site. We have identified some locations for bat boxes at Rushy Common and Tar Lakes, and they will hopefully be going up soon. And we've also identified some larger scale activities for the next couple of years at Rushy Common, and that's likely to include things like accessing the islands, using a boat to do some vegetation management, and some work on the ponds as well. Stanlake Common, as I said, it's been very much the annual maintenance this year, where we've been able to get on site, that is. The main change at Stanlake is that the site is under new ownership. So many of you that attended the forum last year might remember us talking about how the site had been put up for sale. Well, it's now been sold, so we're working with the new landowner on managing the reserve. In terms of our bird hides, they're currently closed. We closed in March, and they remained closed for many months, and then we reorganised to open them at the beginning of November, to then unfortunately be promptly closed again in this second lockdown. But we are all set up now to reopen when we're able to. We've got hand sanitizer dispensers installed, and we've set a maximum capacity for each hide as well, so there'll be a limit on the number of people able to be in there at once. This summer, we carried out a visitor survey at Tar Lake, so I'm just going to briefly talk about that and just share some of the results of that. So we carried out the survey on over 3 days in August, over 12 hours. There was an average of 22.5 visitors per hour. You can see on the map on the screen there, that shows the home postcodes of all of the visitors that we spoke to on those 3 days. There were a few people who had come from further afield, but I haven't included that in this map, just so that you can actually see the local area and the site. After we carried out the survey, I did a few rough calculations, and we think we could have, based on that number of visitors, potentially up to 75,000 visitors a year, which might be an overestimate, but what we're hoping to do is have a more reliable figure after we repeat the survey this winter, probably in February. So that was quite an interesting exercise anyway, and I've just included a few of the stats there on the slide for people to see. We completed a project at the beginning of this year to improve and promote 3 circular walks in the Lower Windrush Valley. So we selected 3 routes and we marked those out using stickers on waymarking discs, and you can see an example of one of those on the slide. We then also replaced 3 stiles with gates to improve access, and also created route descriptions and maps for each of the 3 routes, which can be downloaded from our website. Here are the 3 route descriptions, and that's our website at the top there if anybody is wanting to have a look at our website or download these. On the 1st of June, we launched Kingfisher Quest. Now this project ran over 3 months over the summer, so from the beginning of June to the end of August, and we asked people to send us any kingfisher sightings. The aim was to increase our understanding of kingfishers in the area, promote an interest in local wildlife, and also look at locations for potential habitat enhancements as well. Now I'm going to share a slide of just some of the results. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this project, just because many of you will know we actually had a separate event talking about this project back in early October, I think it was. Now, when we actually have a recording of that webinar, so I'm very happy to share that. If it's of interest, if people contact me and ask for it, I can circulate it. But also there's a project summary available on our website. So just to say, the green dots on that map represent where kingfishers were sighted during those 3 months in the valley. I'm going to hand over to Rachel here, who's going to talk a little bit about the bird nest box project. Rachel, you'll just have to let me know when you want me to go forward a slide.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so we launched our bird nest box project this year. This involved putting up a number of different boxes all on the Windrush Path in Stanlake. So one of the reasons we did this was to create kind of more nesting opportunities for local passerine and little owl populations. These species like to use kind of cavities in trees, little hollows that they can go into and nest in. And because Stanlake is quite a young site, having been made relatively recently with the gravel extraction, the trees around the site are pretty young and therefore don't have the cavities that come with the kind of bigger sized trees. So there are fewer opportunities for them to nest in the area. So putting up boxes allows us to increase their nesting capabilities in the area. Another reason we did this was to start allowing us to monitor the birds at the site. So with the bird boxes we put up, you can actually open them up within the breeding season and ring the chicks that are inside. We're doing this with the help of local bird ringer Ali Bunning. And then with all the monitoring data that you collect from the boxes, you send these records off to the British Trust of Ornithology, and that's submitted as part of their nationwide monitoring programme. This project was funded partly by Linear Fisheries, so thank you very much to them for funding. And we've also had a number of people who have sponsored the boxes. So earlier this year, we sent out an email inviting people to come and adopt the bird boxes. So I think we do have a few opportunities left to sponsor some of the smaller boxes. So if you would like to do this, I think it's about £35. With this, you get a certificate, a little information pack, information about Stanley Common, and you'll also be invited along to a chick ringing session next year in the spring. We were hoping to do this this year, but of course COVID, we had to sadly cancel those sessions. Next slide, Lucy. So we've got a number of different boxes all around the Windrush Path. So the first type was the kind of open fronted boxes in the top left corner. These are particularly good when they're hidden away, and they are good for things like blackbirds, robins, wrens and wagtails. And then the smaller opening boxes, the ones with a 32mm hole, are particularly good for things like great tits, blue tits, flycatchers and tree sparrows, which we know they're kind of in the area. We've also got a couple of little owl boxes up. These were made by Ali and her team, and yeah, specially designed for little owls and put right next to habitat where they're going to be particularly good for hunting small kind of invertebrates and big invertebrates, in fact. Next slide, Lucy. So although we couldn't do the ringing this year, we did go around and clean the boxes with our volunteers. We found evidence of successful breeding in the boxes, 5 for 12. This included finding things like eggshell fragments. And we had another 3 where they were used to some degree, but we couldn't quite confirm if there had been successful breeding within them. That egg in the middle, we think, is from a great tit or a blue tit, and we think the boxes were pretty much exclusively used by these species. Sorry there. We also had a surprise guest in the form of a little pipistrelle bat who was using the box as a nice safe place to roost. Yeah, nice, good to see him using the box throughout the winter. Cool, thanks.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Sorry, did you have something else to add? No. Just to quickly say, if you would like to sponsor one of the boxes, you can get in touch using the email address at the end of the slideshow. Thanks. Yeah, great. And just to say as well, the you said about cleaning out the boxes. Obviously, once we found the bat, we didn't clean that box out. That was quickly put back. So last but not least, on the sort of review of what's been happening in 2020 is our biodiversity opportunity review, and this is something that we'll be carrying over to 2021. We've been looking at, as the title suggests, reviewing biodiversity opportunities in the Lower Windrush Valley. And this is a process that started towards the end of last year when we commissioned the Thames Valley Environmental Records Centre to update the habitat mapping of the valley, which they did, and produced a phase 1 habitat map. We then have used that mapping as well as the project's knowledge of the area and some additional species data to create a series of opportunity maps and objectives for key habitats. And at the moment, we're in the process of pulling this all together into a report, which will be published soon. The idea is that the report will direct the biodiversity elements of our work, so of the Lower Windrush Valley Project strategy, but it's also intended and hoped that it can be a tool for local authorities and planners, help direct biodiversity offsetting funds, and also be used by local land managers to inform any habitat management or enhancement projects that they might have. So now looking forward to 2021 and beyond, we have been updating the Whitney Lake and Country Park interpretation panels. So as you can see, the interpretation panel that's in the left-hand side photograph there has seen better days, and the content is pretty out of date. The other of the 2 panels is actually not even at the Lake and Country Park anymore because it was so damaged that it had to be removed. So we've been pulling together the content for that, and it's currently with the designers. And we hope that we'll have some new panels in place in the new year. We have been working with Freshwater Habitats Trust on a project that will create and restore ponds and also improve the condition of gravel pit lakes in the Lower Windrush Valley. We haven't got secured funding for this project yet, so it's very much in development. We have submitted an application, something we hope to deliver in the next couple of years, so it's a sort of watch this space on that one. Next year we will be creating or doing a piece of work to review access opportunities in the valley. So we'll be identifying and mapping key links or improvements that would improve the footpath and bridleway network in the valley. So this is things like linking the Windrush Path is a pretty key activity for us, but there are other opportunities as well that we would like to map. Do let us know if you have any thoughts or suggestions on these, because we do, there are certain areas of the valley where we get out and walk pretty regularly. And there's other areas that I don't go to so frequently. And obviously, those of you who live in the area and are out walking a lot will know better. So please do get in touch if you've got suggestions. Just to say, that's not for things like a fallen tree or a broken gate. That needs to be reported to the countryside access team at the county council, and I've included their website there. But anything else like a footpath that would be good to upgrade to a bridleway, or a link between two footpaths that's missing, that sort of thing, that's what we're looking for. So please do let us know if you are aware of any of those. Volunteering and events in 2021. Volunteering, where possible, is going to continue, probably in a similar way that it has been run in 2020. So with additional measures in place and limits on numbers, and obviously not running at all if we go into a lockdown as we are at the moment. The events are likely to look different for the foreseeable future, I imagine. I found that dug out this photo on the slide of, this is actually our annual forum last year. So as you can see, we're quite used to running events with lots of people crammed into a village hall. This year we're running it online. It'll be interesting to see how long we need to keep running things online. We're hoping to do some outdoors events next year, but obviously it's completely dependent on restrictions, and we will have to wait and see. But either way, there will be events of some kind. And last but not least, we will be launching a volunteer recording network in 2021 with the aim of increasing species recording in the Lower Windrush Valley. So we already have some informal volunteer recording. Obviously, through the bird hides, we get a lot of bird records that are then entered by volunteers and sent off to TVERC. We sometimes have other sort of ad hoc recording or citizen science events that we take part in. But the idea of this project is really to create a network that we can then build upon. So we're going to start with reptiles in spring and summer 2021. And we've secured some funding to do that and purchase equipment and provide training. But we'll hopefully be able to seek further funding so that we can broaden the species and the numbers of sites that we're able to cover in the future. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, look out for communications on that in the new year, because we'll probably be then looking for our volunteers. Great, well that brings the Lower Windrush Valley Project update to an end. There was a couple of slides where either Rachel or I said, get in touch. So I've just put our email address on the slide there. And what we'll do is I will pass over to Rachel, who is going to ask me any questions if there are any before we go over to Neil for his presentation on reptiles in the Lower Windrush.
Thanks, Lucy. We haven't had any questions yet, so if you do have anything for Lucy or I, do feel free to send them across in the Zoom group chat that will be on the kind of bar either at the top or the bottom of your screen. We have had one comment from Andy Duncan regarding the visitor survey, saying that it's interesting that even local people are arriving by car. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, well, we were quite disappointed actually to see, because it was, I've now lost the slide, but it was something like, I'm going to stop sharing and then hopefully I can start my video so people can see me very briefly. We were quite disappointed to see the 88%, I think it was, of people who arrived by car. But I think possibly what had happened is we did the survey over 6 sessions, so 6 2-hour sessions, and 5 of those it was raining for. So I wonder, obviously it's just a guess, but I'm thinking if it hadn't been raining, possibly more people would have walked from Cogs or from Ducklington to the site, and maybe more people had hopped in their car because the weather wasn't great on those days. I don't know, but yes, it's a bit of a shame, isn't it? We obviously have the nice car park, but equally we've got the lovely bridleways and footpaths that link to the site. So we do want to encourage people to either be cycling or walking.
Thank you. We have got one question from Susan Corrigan, who's asked who has purchased the Stand Lake Reserve?
It's a local farmer who's purchased the reserve. So he's got other land locally and a farm locally.
Thanks. A question from Trevor. When the hides open again, will there be a booking system to avoid too many people arriving at the same time and overcrowding the hides?
We hadn't intended to do a booking system. Our plan at the moment is all of the bird hide key holders will have had an email for the brief period that we reopened, but it will be the same arrangements when we reopen. They've had an email that tells them what the maximum capacity is, and it's also put on a poster on the door of the hides. And what we're hoping will work is that we ask people that if they arrive and there are too many people in there, obviously not to go in. I appreciate that could be disappointing, particularly for people that might have come from further away. So I think probably we'll just have to monitor and see if it becomes an issue with people having travelled, specifically to go to the hide and not being able to go in, then we might have to consider a booking system. But I think hopefully we won't have to do that because they don't tend to be packed full of people every day. So.
We've got another question asking about Stand Lake Common. Is the relationship with a new owner going to be a positive one for wildlife?
Yes, I think so. I'm hopeful that that's the case. Certainly at the moment, we are continuing with the current management arrangements. The management plan is due to be reviewed in 2022 anyway, regardless of the site selling. So that's something that we will be starting to think about next year, reviewing that plan, thinking about how we're managing the site and how we're going to, what our priorities are running forwards.
Okay. I think that's all the questions that we've got at the moment. I imagine we might have a bit of time at the end if anyone has any other questions going forward. But for now, I think we're going to be handing over to Neil, who's going to be telling us about reptiles.
Yes, excellent.
Great stuff.
I think you need to unmute them, don't you, Rachel?
Am I unmuted now, Rachel?
Yeah. There you go. Hi, Neil.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Well, thanks for having me along this evening. This was something that we were going to do before lockdown, wasn't it? So we had a date in the diary to talk about reptiles and the species that you get in the Windrush Valley back in March, April, I think. But obviously the world changed and we've decided to try and cover it tonight. Obviously, if we'd have been in a village hall, I would usually take some specimens and you get to see some live animals. That's not something I can really do tonight. And I'm also going to try and talk about British reptiles in about half the time. So it will probably be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the British reptiles and then the habitat suitability in the Windrush Valley. And then I see that Lucy and Rachel are planning to do some reptile surveys in the coming year. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about survey techniques. And then finally, just a few of the kind of minor habitat adjustments that you can do to encourage reptiles either on nature reserves like tile lakes or of course even in your own garden. So that's what I'll try to do. I'll probably miss out loads of things, so if there's any questions please put them on the chat function and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. So I'll just see if I can share my screen. How's that, Rachel? Is that working?
I can't see anything at the moment. Lucy, I don't know.
Bear with me.
Ah, Lucy can see that. I can't. Ah, there we go.
How's that?
Yes, there we go. Okay, I can see that now.
Good. Okay. Technological problems. Okay, so firstly, I'll just tell you what species we've got in Britain. So altogether, we have 6 native reptiles, which doesn't sound like very many, but when you think that we are a small and cold temperate island sort of flung out in the North Sea, it's not too bad at all, really. So we have 3 species of lizard, 3 species of snake. And these are the 3 lizards. So one of them, this one here up on the right, is a sand lizard, which is a real habitat specialist. So this is our only egg-laying lizard, and it needs either sand or soil with very, very low organic matter in it in order to lay its eggs. So it tends to be restricted to the southern heathlands or dune systems, so mainly the southern parts of England, but there's also a fairly stable, healthy colony in the Wirral near to Merseyside. So you definitely won't find these around here. But if you do get the chance to go and see them, they're very impressive. They're probably about twice the size of this thing, the common lizard, and probably twice the build. So sand lizard's a really impressive animal, but one of our rarities. This one is known as the common lizard. It makes me wince a little bit these days to refer to animals like this as common. They're nowhere near as frequently found as they were when I was a boy. The other name for them is a viviparous lizard, which I'll come on to in a little while. But this is one of the animals which you'll find in the Lower Windrush Valley. And then the third one is the slow worm, which looks superficially like a worm, I guess, hence the name. Often mistaken for a snake by people that find it in the garden, but it is actually a lizard as well. It's quite an unusual one for a far-flung small island like ours. It's one of about 200 ophidiosaurs, which means snake lizard. So across the world, there's probably about 6,500 lizard species, give or take, and a couple of hundred of those are these quite highly evolved snake lizards. Most of them have tiny vestigial limbs. The slow worm is one of only about 40 odd species, which is completely legless. So it looks superficially like a snake, but it's very much a lizard. I'll say a little bit more about this one in a moment. So those are our 3 lizard species. We also have 3 snakes. So the one that people tend to know about from folklore and often recognize because of its zigzag pattern is this one. So this is the adder. It tends to like kind of free draining soils, not so much low-lying clay vales. So there are large tracts of Oxfordshire where it was never particularly common. It wouldn't have been very much at home in the Lower Windrush Valley, although I suspect there would have been 1 or 2 colonies probably 40, 50 years ago. It is one of those species which is not enjoying modern Britain and is starting to fall off the face of the cliff. It still does fairly well in upland areas in the north of England, the coastal areas of Wales, coastal areas of the east of England and the West Country, but it's pretty much disappearing from central England. So anywhere that's highly populated or highly modified for agriculture, this snake doesn't seem to cope very well. And it went extinct in Oxfordshire about 3 or 4 years ago. We think that the last reliable colony sort of ceased to function. So sadly, one that we've lost around here. It's not one that you'll see in the Windrush Valley. The one at the top right here is another one of those British rarities. So this is the smooth snake. It's probably even more habitat specialist than the sand lizard. Tends to like the same sort of places, the southern heaths of Dorset, Hampshire, Surrey. This one is restricted to those kind of habitats because it eats almost nothing but other reptiles. So it's quite a small snake. This is a big adult female, which I caught on a site near Corfe Castle a few years ago. That's about as big as they get. So obviously baby ones are tiny. They can curl up on a sort of 1p piece. And you need a very big supply of baby reptiles, basically, to keep smooth snakes going. So an interesting thing to go looking for. Rare as hen's teeth, very difficult to come across, sort of holy grail of British reptiles. It was probably more widespread once. It would have probably made its way into the counties of Berkshire and Wiltshire, but it's incredibly secretive and it wasn't described to science until 1836. So very, very recently when you think that this is Britain and that is a vertebrate. So if you see a snake anywhere in our part of the world, it's going to be one of these. And this is a grass snake doing what it usually does. They're very wary and alert animals. You tend to see them either just disappearing into a clump of grass, or more often you get this kind of classic picture of a grass snake swimming across a pond. So this is the only snake which we find in this part of the world now, and it is by far the most widespread and common, in inverted commas, snake that we find in Britain. So those are our 6 reptiles. It would be probably remiss of me not to remark upon 1 or 2 others. So in this day and age, a lot of animals are kept as pets, and you get many, many exotics either turned out deliberately or escaping into the wild. Going back many decades, even preceding the Wildlife and Countryside Act, people were trying to establish garter snakes from America and European dice snakes, but they never really caught on. I put this one up here. This is a Paraguay anaconda. In a longer talk, I've got a really good anecdote about this one, where I was hugely professionally embarrassed by telling a lady in Bristol that the green snake with black spots and a yellow head was a grass snake, and she asked me to come and collect it, and I wouldn't. And eventually we got to the bottom of it, and it was an anaconda. I did collect it in the end, and I found it a suitable home. But you do get weird things turn up occasionally, but they almost never survive in the British climate, and especially over winter. There are a couple of exceptions though. This thing up here is Podarcis. This is the wall lizard. This has actually established itself quite a few times in Britain now, most notably along the cliffs. If any of you go to Bournemouth with any frequency, those kind of sea cliffs above the beach, lots of colonies of these things. And then this one, this is an Aesculapian snake, another European animal, but this has established itself twice in a couple of different parts of the UK now. And it's been there for 50, 60 years in each location, and it's breeding pretty well. So it's just unusual that these 2 species, for whatever reason, have found themselves at home in Britain. And I've got a couple of these actually, and I have one to hand. If there's enough time at the end, I'll show it to you. But there are a couple of animals which have been here long enough now that you could start to ask the question, are they naturalized aliens, or should we start to consider them part of our herpetofauna? So a slightly more in-depth look at the animals that you'll find around here and in the Lower Windrush Valley. The most common one is the slow worm. It's probably also the most difficult to find. They're very adaptable animals. They have very catholic habitat choices. They're not too fussy as long as there's somewhere to hide and there's plenty of food. So you tend to find them not only in pristine habitats and nature reserves, but you'll also find them in sort of rough edges of parklands, even large gardens, anywhere where there's rank grassland and plenty of slugs, which is their favorite food. They are what's considered subfossorial. So like all of the snake lizards, they don't have any external legs anymore. Legs are a bit of a hindrance when you find yourself burrowing either in topsoil or deeper underground. So slow worms spend a lot of time in the surface layer of soil, also in leaf litter and plant roots, where a sort of smooth cylindrical body is a help, basically. If you were to x-ray them, just like all the snake lizards, you would find evidence of external limbs. So the slow worm has a really pretty much unchanged pelvic girdle, actually. You can see all the hip structure, and they still have a kind of vestigial clavicle girdle as well, where the shoulder blades would have been, but no external legs whatsoever. So how could you tell that this wasn't a snake? Well, the 2 key differences, apart from those anatomical ones which you'd have to x-ray, is that if you see a slow worm in the hand, it will blink every once in a while. Many lizards can blink, or do blink, not all. There are a few lizards which don't have eyelids, but no snakes have movable eyes. They have a clear scale called the brill over the eye. So the slow worm is quite easily distinguished from a snake because it will blink at you. The other thing it can do is flick out its tongue. You'll see it has a slightly forked tongue, a bit like a snake's, but it's nowhere near as long or as bifurcated. But what they can't do, which snakes can, is flick their tongue out without opening their mouth. So you'll see every time a slow worm flicks his tongue, he kind of opens his mouth a little bit. And snakes have a little groove in the rostral scale on the nose here, so they can flick their tongues in and out. You'd obviously have to be quite close to see all that, but those are kind of the telltale signs that this is a lizard and not a snake. The other thing it can do, which a snake can't, is break its tail off. So you can see this one here has got a kind of new wound. And this is a process called autotomy. So what the lizard can do is when it feels under threat, so if it's being attacked by a predator, for example, It thinks its life is in danger. It can contract muscles in the tail, and it has fracture planes between the vertebrae and the tail, and this basically shatters the cartilage, drops the tail off, and then the nerve impulses in the broken tail thrash around like crazy. And if the slow worm is lucky, then the aggressor basically attacks the tail, and the slow worm makes it away to live another day. It's curious, like you find more slow worms with broken tails than you do other lizard species, but I have very seldom seen them break tails through rough handling. So I've seen even children handle these things very, very roughly, and they almost never drop their tails. So whatever's making slow worms drop their tails, it isn't really humans or rough handling, it is probably predator interaction. And their main predators really are things like hedgehogs and badgers, and then in the modern age, a lot of them fall prey to cats as well. But an interesting little animal, and it's more or less ubiquitous. Where you tend not to find it is in areas that are prone to repeat flooding. So it will be found, it is found throughout the Lower Windrush Valley, but you won't find it in areas where the river tops over, or whether a lot of standing water stands on the land, because obviously these are air-breathing animals, and they would drown over winter if they were underground and floodplain overtopped. So, but other than that, they're easy enough to find if you know how to. This is that common or viviparous lizard again. These again are scattered throughout the Lower Windrush Valley. Today they seem to be quite localized, so they're not terribly mobile, and when populations get separated from each other by fragmentation from land clearance or development or road building, you get more and more isolated populations, and I suspect they fizzle out over time. A lot of the places I used to go looking for these when I was a boy are fruitless nowadays, but quite a charming little animal. This is a male doing what they usually do. It's a fairly classic repose. He's sitting on a bit of boardwalk in a nature reserve very close to some undergrowth, and you quite often find them basking low down, ready to disappear with any signs of trouble. This is a couple mating. Another good way to tell them apart, if you get close enough or have them in the hand, is that the females always have this kind of washed out creamy coloured venter. The males are more kind of golden and spotty, a little bit vaguely like a grey crested newt, I guess. But these are, I would probably say, the most at-risk reptile in the Lower Windrush Valley at the moment. And then, of course, the grass snake. So if you see a snake, it's not an adder. You might misidentify a slow worm perhaps, but it isn't anything other than the grass snake if you actually see a snake. They're really variable, so they can be kind of limey green, pale green, greeny brown, almost blackish. So they can be very dark snakes or actually quite light and pretty, and they have various different patterns of cross-banding and spots across the flanks and the dorsum. The real giveaway, whatever colour they are, and it's not always easy to see this if all you're seeing is the back half disappearing into a bush, but grass snakes always have either a yellow or a yellowy white collar just behind the heads, and then there's always a strong black collar just behind this. And no matter what colour they are or how close to being melanistic they are, they always have this distinctive collar. So it's an easy way to tell them apart, and though they're harmless, but of course in our part of the world it doesn't really matter because it is a grass snake. You see a snake, it can't be anything else. And they depend on good populations of amphibians. They'll occasionally take fish, they'll occasionally take small mammals, but and occasionally ground nesting birds, but to all intents and purposes, most of their diet is amphibians. So it sort of falsely gets considered to be an aquatic or a semi-aquatic snake. It really isn't. It's very much a terrestrial animal that's just at home in the water. They have big home ranges, much larger than the other two snakes, so males will cover up to 10 square kilometres in the course of an active summer. So they roam, they're not particularly faithful to any particular areas, so they will go a very, very long way from water, and of course lots of amphibians can be found away from water, away from the breeding season. So it's a very, very active animal that covers a lot of turf, and it tends to be seen around water because that's where prey lives. The other things they need are suitable egg incubation sites. So this is our only egg-laying snake, and there are pros and cons of being an egg layer or a live bearer, like most of our other reptiles. the con, of course, is that if you're going to lay eggs in a temperate country, you can't really guarantee that the temperature will always be warm enough for them to hatch. So grass snakes get around this by using kind of piles of rotting vegetation. So you can see some eggs here in a compost heap. They're kind of traditionally associated with compost heaps and muck heaps in stable yards and in larger allotments and gardens. But if you think about it, there weren't always people making compost heaps. So this snake would have relied on big accumulations of flood debris coming down the river channels in the days before the rivers were tamed. And also there was a time when every great big old tree that fell would make it, would basically decay to nothing. So they would use rotting stumps and fallen trees in a suitable state of decay, and also big piles of kind of flood debris or anywhere else where they were finding big piles of organic matter. And of course, the value of that is that you get decomposition in these piles, and it raises the temperature 2 or 3 degrees above ambient, and it also keeps it very constant. So the snakes are quite clever and will rummage around in these piles and will find a spot with the right temperature for their eggs and lay them, and they will know then that the eggs are going to be safe until the hatching date. So the kind of habitats they like. This top left one here is your kind of gold standard. So this is mature lowland heath, Thomas Hardy type country. There's almost none of this left in Oxfordshire anymore, but where it occurs in Britain, it has usually has very, very high reptile populations. So it has big populations of invertebrates for the lizards to feed on, and then they often support big populations of amphibians, and then of course there is also lots of reptiles for the rarities to eat as well. However, kind of rough rank grasslands like this down here, or brownfield sites, this is probably an old brownfield site with a bit of ragwort in here, this kind of place where you get structure and cover, but also plenty of low vegetation that sunlight can get down and warm the surface of the ground, tends to be very good for reptiles as well. So, and they're not fussy. Reptiles don't breed flora keys. They're not particularly interested in MG4 grassland. All they like is cover and a food supply. So if you've got largely unmanaged grassland, which has got lots of slugs and soft-bodied invertebrates, it's heaven for things like slow worms, and it tends to support grass snakes and lots of other species as well. In our part of the world, the reason that we have those 3 species, the grass snake, the slow worm and the common lizard, is because they're the most adaptable. The 3 specialists are either confined to different parts of the country, or in the case of the adder, they are going towards being confined to very localized areas. Grass snakes and the 2 lizards are quite adaptable, and you often find that they have colonized sort of heavily human influenced habitats. So allotments like this one, in a good one with plenty of cover that isn't too tidy, you can almost always find plenty of slow worms there to feed on the slugs, and you will find grass snakes traversing through looking for frogs and toads. And common lizards too. As long as there's plenty of debris piles and plenty to eat, it's not uncommon to find them in places like that. And then finally, of course, what we have lots and lots of in the Lower Windrush Valley is wetland. So this, I think, is Rushy Common. It's perfect for grass snakes that like aquatic prey. And when you get these kind of grassy margins integrating with hedgerows and light areas of woodlands, it gives you that kind of nice mosaic that reptiles like. So there is plenty of decent habitat in the Lower Windrush Valley, and there's plenty of potential as well. You have to remember that it's a pretty modified landscape, isn't it? The Lower Windrush Valley Project area. So if it hasn't been gravel extracted and then restored, it's certainly been converted to intensive agriculture over the last sort of 50, 60 years or so. So it's changed a lot, but those 3 species are quite adaptable and will tend to make the best of it. And as long as you don't completely extirpate populations, all 3 of them are mobile enough, in the case of the grass snake, or long-lived enough in the case of the slow worm, that they will ride out any kind of compromises of their overall habitat mosaic in a landscape, and provided it isn't too fragmented afterwards, they tend to proliferate again. So they cling on even with those sort of activities going, and then when you start to, restoring former extraction sites to wetlands and nature reserves like Smiths do, creates perfect habitat for grass snakes. As long as you can encourage enough amphibians, they'll proliferate and thrive, and so will the other 2 species if they're already there. So how do you find them? There are several methods really of looking for reptiles. One of them is to just go and walk around and actually look for them. So you can try direct observation. That kind of requires skill. It also requires you to have enough knowledge to sort of second guess where you'll expect to find them anyway. But if you walk along quietly, particularly in springtime when animals are cold and basking more often, it's perfectly feasible to do a good survey by walking along and looking for them. It's not quite so effective for things like grass snakes because they tend to hear you coming. And as I've said, even with the best will in the world, it's rare that you come across a basking grass snake that hasn't seen you. So to increase your chances of finding all of the species that are there, the most common way is to use artificial refuges. So some of you have probably seen these. That it can be a metre by a half metre of hardboard, plywood, corrugated tin, roofing felt, carpet tile. So there are many different materials you can use. By far the most successful across the board is corrugated tin. And that's because snakes seem to like it in particular. Slow worms aren't too fussy, they'll go under anything, but corrugated tin confers the advantage of not only trapping solar heat and making a small warm spot, but they're also heavy and immovable, so the animal that's under it feels safe and secure. So corrugated tin is your favourite. Roofing felt is cheap and easy to get though, and almost as good. And then going down the list, things like boards and carpet tiles are a distant third and fourth. Having said that, if you potter around an allotment where you've got slow worms, you tend to find them by lifting up, old fertilizer bags and bin lids and things. So anything that's kind of heavy enough to make the animal feel secure and also capable of absorbing enough solar energy to make them actually marginally warmer than the surrounding area will attract reptiles. Location is kind of a bit of, again, skill and experience. If you tend to put your survey refuges in open ground on a nice piece of short grass, the chances of a reptile crossing open ground where it's vulnerable to go under a tin are pretty slim. If you put your tin somewhere which gets sun for 60, 70, 80% of the day, and it's also on a kind of margin between shorter habitats and much more kind of ranker cover, then that's obviously going to be a better place. But over a period of time, you start to get a feel for it, and it can be quite enjoyable. If you've got a good reptile site where you're going to find lots of animals, then it can be a really fun way to spend an afternoon going around and checking tins. Survey effort depends. I'm quite happy, Lucy, to talk about where you want to survey next year and help if I can, but the standard guidelines are that you should use about 10 or so refuges for every hectare that you're trying to survey. And to this day, if any of you are more interested in how to do reptile surveys, there is a guide by Frog Life. It's Frog Life Advice Sheet 10. You can find it really easily on the internet by Googling it. It's 20+ years old now. It looks a bit dated, but it's still the gold standard. No one's really improved on the techniques in there or the advice that it gives. So it's a really good place to start. And then there are one or two other kind of bit more sort of left field approaches. You can try and find bits of slough skin, but it's difficult. It doesn't last long. Often the animals will shed it in deep undergrowth and it can be quite hard to find. Or you can use radio telemetry. This is uncommon. You tend to use this as part of research projects. I've used it in the past on various species. Most recently, we did some work in a previous job on the adder population in and around Greenham Common in Berkshire. So we spent 3 years putting the radio transmitters on adders and following them around and charting their progress. It was all very good fun, but it's kind of a bit high tech for average presence, likely absent surveys. But it's available to you, and it is good fun. And so these are the methods in action. So the top picture is a gentleman lifting a tin of corrugated iron. That's your gold standard tin, really nice and big and long. This is in Ensham Churchyard. We helped the parish there do some reptile surveys earlier in the year. Perfectly sited on a southern facing aspect in some kind of rough grassland and nettle cover just in front of the churchyard. So we put these down and we found plenty of slow worms there. This is, Lucy will recognise this. She's already put this picture up. I pinched this off your Facebook today. Occasionally you will find really good snake skins. So if you find a snake skin like this one, which was found, I think it was Tire Lakes, Rushy Common, it's conclusive. You've got grass snakes there. But often, as I say, they'll be trying to sort of wind their way through thick vegetation to peel their skins off. And slow worms, when they shed their skins, they, whereas the snakes just cut their lips and then turn the whole thing inside out and peel it off in one go. Lizards tend to shed in fragments, and slow worms do a sort of halfway house thing. So they shed in one piece, but it all sort of bunches up, a bit like scrunching a glove on a finger, I guess. So it makes it difficult to find. And of course, this stuff is only one cell thick. It's only the epidermis, so it doesn't last very long. So if you find skins, you know, it's 100% conclusive you've got a particular animal there, but I wouldn't rely on it really as a survey technique. And then here's some slow worms under carpet tile. Carpet will work okay if it's not got soggy yet and it hasn't started to mold. It tends to cause very, very high humidity levels under the tins, which most animals don't like. But I put this up here just because I found it. It just shows that slow worms are pretty free and easy, really. They'll go under anything as long as it's still fairly dry. But I would never used this as part of a professional survey. Roofing felt is a much better option. So that's how you would survey for them. And then finally, just a few words about what you can do to actually encourage reptiles either into, you know, the nature reserves or the restored sites in the Windrush Valley, or even in your own garden. So again, it comes back to cover and prey availability. So if you can let your grass go nice and rank, and I'm sure many of you recognise this sort of fairly typical conservation brash pile, where you pile up logs and branches and arisings from your habitat management. It just provides cover for, you know, you quite often just find common lizards peeking about, looking at you in these, and you also find that over time as they decay, you get more and more suitable prey items for things like slow worms, common lizards. You can see this one even has got a tin next to it, so that's in a nature reserve. If you want grass snakes, you want amphibians. So wildlife ponds are always brilliant in any landscape. One of the things that limits amphibians populations is fish. So if you've got large lakes or stocked lakes, you'll often find that things like toads and frogs will spawn in them, but the chances of those that spawn making it to maturity is much, much lower. It does happen, but the best way to really have thriving amphibian and thriving grass snake populations is to have networks of very small pools, some of which are ephemeral in a landscape. And you find that, you know, even garden ponds, very small garden ponds, provide a really important function. You'd be surprised how often people dig a little pond and then find that they had newts the first year, and next year somebody sees a snake in the garden. So they do find them and they do hunt in them. And then thirdly, for grass snakes, again, it's fundamental that they have those egg-laying opportunities. So given that man's tidy approach to the modern countryside has robbed them of some of those natural features, they're now reliant on us for things like compost heaps and manure piles, and it's very easy to make a sort of advanced version of these brash piles for grass snakes. So you can put lots of logs down and then finer and finer material, and then pop a load of grass clippings on top and a tarpaulin over it. And as long as it decomposes, it'll be perfect for grass snakes. This is a picture of something that you occasionally see if you're really lucky. This is just tons of female grass snakes under a carpet cover on a great big compost heap. So once they found somewhere that they like, you will find that you get really big aggregations of nest-laying females on occasion, and they know where they are. So you get the same animals coming back to the same heaps year after year. So you know, they're smart enough to know where the best egg-laying opportunities are and to return to them. So if you can build these things specifically for grass snakes, it gives them every opportunity in the world to expand their populations. And if you've got a compost heap because you want a compost heap rather than a grass snake egg-laying pile, if you care, it's a good idea not to turn them over between sort of egg-laying time in early June and when the hatchlings emerge, sort of late August, early September. So if you can leave your compost piles alone during that period, it will help grass snakes enormously. But other than that, they need habitat. So when you have landscapes like the Lower Windrush Valley, you've got lots of created wetlands, lots of restored habitat mosaics, and as long as you've got enough animals there to inoculate them, you can put in some of these additional features, and you should find that you should have a healthy reptile populations. So I think I managed that in the time I was given. So I thank you very much for listening, and if there's any questions, then I will do my very best, obviously.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. That was really interesting. We do have some questions. Catherine said, I found an emerald green snake on our doorstep in summer. It had the same markings as a grey-green grass snake, but was really bright green. I assume that was an alien species and not a variant of native grass snake.
It's hard to say without seeing a picture, but my gut feeling would be it's a grass snake. When young juvenile snake species, and grass snakes are no different, tend to be much, much brighter and bolder coloured when they're hatchlings. They tend to get darker and more muted as they reach sexual maturity. So I've seen some really, really quite sort of emerald coloured looking grass snakes, even as adults, but I suspect that if she saw it, if it wasn't an escaped exotic, which I suspect it probably wasn't, then it would actually be a grass snake.
Okay. Andy said, do all the reptiles hibernate? I assume he means UK reptiles.
Yeah, they do. So animals that live in temperate climates like ours find the winter times too harsh, so they hibernate over the winter period. It's more technically brumation than hibernation with our reptiles, so they go into a very kind of torpid state, but all you need is a brief warm period and they will start to stir again. And the one that's most notorious for coming in and out of hibernation is the adder. So they have been seen in all months of the year, and I've been to sites where I've been working with adders and I've seen 5 in the morning, and then I've had 3 inches of snowfall in the afternoon. So they're very cold tolerant. All you need is a bit of sunshine and a bit of warmer temperatures, and they'll come out and about. And it's thought that it's one of the many difficulties that they have is because of climate change. Our winters aren't cold enough for adders to really become dormant for long periods of time, and they're using too much energy over the winter. But all of our species hibernate. You tend to find that slow worms probably go down the latest, but everything is asleep by this time of year now.
Yeah. Gavin has asked, is there any evidence that sewage pollution, I think he means, in the River Windrush is affecting reptiles such as the grass snake?
No, there isn't. But it stands to reason, doesn't it? I mean, you know, amphibians, which are their really favourite prey, don't usually like flowing water. You will find newts and frogs in very slow flowing channels and backwaters, but they really prefer the standing water. Having said that, when you're in a floodplain and you get river water inundating small ponds, the water quality is much of a muchness. It doesn't make sense really that you know, the pollution levels we've got in our watercourses these days hasn't affected fish populations and amphibian populations, and of course you're at the bottom of the food chain and being eaten by something bigger, that there has to be an effect, you know. So the answer to the question is no evidence, nobody's looked into it, but I would imagine that it's going to be one of the many factors that's responsible for the decline of reptiles and lots of other creatures as well.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Susan's asked, what should you do if you find grass snake eggs?
If you find them in a compost heap, the best thing to do is just leave them alone. They can take a fair amount of disturbance, but unlike birds' eggs, they're very different. They don't have a spindle which holds the embryo in a certain position. So while birds turn their eggs frequently to stop them from dying, reptile eggs are quite the opposite. So once they're set in position, that's where they need to stay throughout incubation. So if you got some reptile eggs and roughly handled them and turned them upside down, the embryos would probably die. They can handle a bit of disturbance, but if you've got, you know, I suppose if you've discovered grass snake eggs in a compost heap or an old muck heap or something, and you're happy to just cover them over and leave them, that's the best thing to do. If you get some that have been, you know, and it does happen if you genuinely destroyed a nesting site, or a third party has found them and gone, what are these? Then you could put them in a box with some moistish tissue just to keep the humidity up, and as long as you keep them at kind of high room temperature, they usually hatch. The optimum is about 26-ish for grass snake eggs to successfully incubate, but there are countless stories of people just keeping them on the shelf in their room and finding that they hatch. So
Wow.
either of those, put them back if you can. If not, move them somewhere safe and see what happens.
Yeah. Okay, and then there was one last question, which I think you've already answered. It was from Martin, and it said, if compost heaps are good for a good habitat, should you avoid digging your own garden heap? And I think the answer was try and avoid it between June and August. Is that right?
Yeah, if you can avoid turning them over while there may be eggs in there. I mean, if you know for sure there's eggs in there and you care about that, then don't turn them over between June and the end of August. If you don't know, I suppose you go about your business, but yeah, avoid turning the heaps over if you're concerned about grass snakes. And you know, if you really can, and you know, either if you run a nature reserve like you do, Lucy, or if you've got a big garden and you've got a massive compost heap that you want for compost, if you can build a secondary one that's entirely for the grass snakes and leave it alone and throw a bit of fresh material, grass cuttings, leaves on it every couple of years just to keep that kind of decay happening, it's a brilliant feature for them.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. We are now at 8 o'clock, so we won't take any more questions, but I don't know, do you want to, I'm sure people would like to see your snake friend, Neil, if you...
Oh yeah, okay. Bear with me.
Okay.
Here he is. So this is an Aesculapian snake. It's that animal I was talking about before. So there he is. It works better in a village hall, doesn't it? This sort of thing. But maybe, you know, maybe when the world changes again, we can do this again, and I can bring in an adder and a grass snake and for people to have a look at. But this is a 3-year-old male Aesculapian snake. I mean, these are quite interesting, apart from the fact that they've established themselves in Britain without very much help on a couple of occasions. It's also the one which was revered by both Romans and the Greeks. So this is, you know, the medical staff with the snake entwined around it. That's this one. It's supposed to have beneficial healing powers, and it was encouraged around temples, etc. So that's probably why it's quite so widespread across mainland Europe. The theory is that these things were taken around by the Romans as a sort of good luck talisman. But they're quite interesting beasts.
Yeah. How many snakes and reptiles do you have?
Do I have?
Yeah, do you have at home?
Excuse me. I've got 6 snakes. So my first job, I was into reptiles when I was a little boy, and my first job after leaving university, I did a biology degree, and then I was very lucky to get a job as curator of reptiles, because back in those days there weren't many people that knew how to care for these sort of things. So I was kind of largely self-taught, and I stopped keeping reptiles when I worked at the zoo because it was a busman's holiday. But I've got a couple of king snakes which were a leaving present from the zoo 25 years ago. I've got a couple of diamond pythons which are very considered difficult to keep, but I find them actually quite easy. They were my midlife crisis. It was either buy those or buy a Porsche, and then I got these as well. So these I bought because in that long hot summer a couple of years ago, it was really difficult to go and find reptiles to show people for talks or workshops. And that's another thing that people forget about British reptiles. They like typical British temperatures. So when you get those really long hot summers, they all disappear. They do exactly the same as they do in the wintertime. They become torpid and shut down and find somewhere, excuse me, away from the heat. So I found a pair of these just so that I would always have a snake at home and I wouldn't have to waste half a day trying to find something. And of course, there's a story about them adapting pretty well to life in Britain. So 6 altogether, not lots and lots.
I was imagining you there with hundreds. Right, okay, we will bring the event to a close now then. Thank you very much everybody for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations. As I said, the event has been recorded, so I will send that round by email tomorrow in case there's anybody you would like to share it with. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Cheers.